Good morning. This is the OHSU Effect Inside Health and Science. I'm Lacey Evans. Thanks for spending part of your Saturday with us. We have a great show today at 8:35. We're going to talk about travel medicine, which a lot of us don't think about when we get ready for a vacation. We'll talk about vaccinations and other health precautions you might need to take while traveling. But first, we're going to talk about water toxins, particularly harmful algae blooms, which could also affect your travel plans. With me now on the OHSU Effect is Dr. Tawna Peterson, an assistant professor at OHSU's Division of Environmental and Biomolecular Systems and co-investigator at the Center for Coastal Margin Observation and Prediction. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, tell us what harmful algae blooms are, what causes them, what do they look like?
Well, harmful algae blooms are actually a diverse group of organisms, microbial organisms, so little things you can't see unless you use a microscope. And you can often see a bloom as a proliferation of these cells. So you get sort of a big, visible scum on the surface of a lake or a red-colored discoloration of the water. And oftentimes these are just formed by cells that multiply very rapidly and increase their biomass so you can see it. In a lake, these are usually caused by cyanobacteria, which are they're bacteria, so they're just like any other bacteria, but they photosynthesize and they therefore have pigments that you can see. And so these kind of blooms tend to happen a lot in lakes and rivers. In the ocean, you get sort of a different type that are usually more reddish colored. So algal blooms in general just represent these proliferations of cells, like I said, and some of them are harmful and some are not. And so there's a distinction that you can make between those that cause harm and may produce toxins or deplete oxygen levels, things like that. Versus cells that just happen to be present at high concentrations.
Yeah, I was going to ask how they affect people. So let's talk about the ones that are harmful. How will they affect people?
Okay, so a couple different ways. If you were, say, a recreational boater or swimmer, or you have a dog even, in lakes, you want to worry about harmful cyanobacteria because they can produce liver toxins. So many of the species that form those kinds of blooms result in dog deaths. For example, if the dogs drink the water, they can actually die from that exposure. Otherwise, they might just make the lake smell bad, or you just don't want to go swimming in it. Some of the toxins can be aerosolized and can cause sort of respiratory distress or things like that. If you consume a lot of them, for example, if you're eating shellfish or something like that that accumulates the toxin, then you can get sick, either gastrointestinal type of stuff, or some of the toxins that are produced actually are neurotoxins that can cause memory loss and other harmful effects, even including death.
Where is this bacteria coming from? Is it occurring naturally in the water, or are humans bringing it in?
For the most part, they're natural organisms, so they're natural toxins. So they include the algae we're talking about are cyanobacteria, which are bacteria, and also other protists, which are more. They're not quite plants or animals. They're a little bit more basic than that, but they're eukaryotes like we are, or like any other plant or animal. And so they produce natural toxins just as a result of their growth and metabolism. And in some cases, it's harmful to us just because they're very similar to other chemicals in our brains, for example. So the question of are we causing them is an interesting one, because for a long time it was thought that there was an increase in monitoring of these kinds of blooms, and it wasn't clear whether or not humans had anything to do with the increase that we seem to be observing worldwide. But actually, in many cases, the increased inputs of fertilizer and other nutrients to water systems can cause these blooms, because the algae, all they need to grow is sunlight and nutrients. And if you provide them with nutrients, for example, from agricultural runoff or septic tank leakages or things like that, you can actually cause them to grow more, and then we see these larger blooms. So worldwide, the increase in the amount of fertilizer produced has tended to increase the blooms overall, and so we do have more problems than we used to have in the past.
Are there ways to monitor these blooms?
Yeah, so a lot of effort is going into monitoring blooms remotely is the most cost-effective way. So if you use sensors that can detect the pigments that are in the algae, that's one way to do it. And so if you have enough sensors in the water to look at the water conditions, like the temperature and also signatures like the pigments, you can detect them remotely and sort of monitor the base state. And then when things change, you can go out there and take samples and confirm whether or not you're seeing a bloom. that's one really good way to do it. Other ways are just to monitor shellfish meat, for example, or even just taking water samples to look for the blooms. And so we're really moving towards ways of detecting the organisms of interest remotely, and also modeling the conditions that might lead to blooms. And so there's been a real push towards predicting when and where a bloom might occur and whether it's toxic. And that's really tough to do. So that's an active area of research right now.
Well, what specific research is being conducted in your lab at OHSU that addresses this issue?
So we do a couple of different things. One is that I guess three different things. One is that we go out on ships and collect samples to match up the oceanographic conditions. So we mostly focus on ocean-related harmful algae in my lab. And we look at the conditions that might coincide with bloom events. And so we do know some things. We know that when the waters become very stratified and there's sufficient nutrients available, then you might have a bloom under certain conditions. So we look for those kinds of things. And we partner with monitoring agencies when we can. The other way is to try and improve our ability to detect the algae remotely. So there's a recurring and actually non-harmful bloom that occurs in the Columbia River every summer. And we're using that as kind of an example bloom to learn about how blooms form and develop and are maintained. So we have a suite of sensors as part of a network in the Columbia River estuary that we call Saturn. And those in situ sensors can tell us a lot about the water conditions. And so we can look for signatures of this algal species that blooms using its particular fluorescence, so the light that it emits when you shine a light on it and it re-emits light, and we can detect that and associate it with this one particular organism. So we can match up the conditions that lead up to these blooms and use that as an example. And the third thing that we do in our lab is to do laboratory studies on cultures. So we isolate organisms from the environment, and we monitor different effects of that are associated with toxin production. So just looking at the physiology of the cell to try and understand more about what makes it produce toxins. In many cases, it's related to some sort of physiological stress, and we can't necessarily easily pinpoint what that is, but we can make some generalized predictions about environmental conditions that lead to stress that might then result in toxin production.
What's the difference between an algae bloom and a red tide? You mentioned that red tide is what's in the ocean, and I think I've seen that at Seaside. Mm-hmm. So what is the difference there?
So they're really the same thing. It's just a matter of sort of the communities that use the terms, really. So algae is kind of a general term for any photosynthetic organism in a water body. So that includes seaweeds and other types of organisms like that. A more specific term is phytoplankton, which is what I usually tend to use, which literally just means wandering photosynthesizer. So plankton just is a Greek word for wandering. So they just float in the water. So phytoplankton is the term that I like to use, but algae bloom kind of gets adopted by many people because it's a familiar kind of word. And in particular, algae blooms are more likely to be the ones that are found in fresh water. So algae blooms tend to be the ones that are in lakes and rivers, and that's how we tend to describe them. And red tides are more the ocean side of things. So it's just the same thing, just kind of referred to specifically to the environment that they're in.
Sure. What kind of public awareness programs are available for people to learn where blooms are occurring and if it's harmful and if it's one that they should stay away from?
So that's a really interesting question because it takes a lot of effort to make people aware when the bloom's occurring. So you have to have a good monitoring program and be quite up to date on whether or not there's a problem that's going on. And so in recent years, there's been a program with the Oregon Health Authority in the Office of Environmental Public Health where they've developed a surveillance program, and that's only been going on for the last few years. I think this is the 5th year they've been doing it, and it's been really successful. They monitor a lot of the lakes in Oregon, and they put up signage to be able to tell the public to either not go in the water or to alert them to when there's a problem. On the seawater side of things, the Oregon Department of Agriculture and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife monitor sites about every 20 kilometers down the coast. So they monitor shellfish meat and also do cell counts in the water just to see if there's any potentially harmful algae present. And their website is very good. So you can go there and see if there's any closures to watch out for and any potentially interesting toxin levels in the water. They report that on their website. So you can actually, as long as you have access to a computer, you can usually find some information.
Dr. Tawna Peterson, thank you.
Thank you.